Under the twin suns of Korrath Prime, the arena burned red with blood and fury. Jace Ryder stood alone, shirtless, sweat-slicked muscles gleaming, scars painted with alien gore. The last human alive, a broken blade in his grip, facing the Vorgoth, towering beasts of spiked black steel, mandibles gnashing for his flesh. The crowd of thousands screamed for his end, their roars a tidal wave of deathlust. He was meant to fall here, a sacrifice to their savage game. But in the shadows, she watched. Veyra, the Kalthari doctor, blue skin glowing like molten sapphire, golden eyes blazing with a hunger she couldn't name. Her tight tunic clung to her, a tease of curves in a world ruled by slaughter. Then she touched him. His sweat hit her senses, raw, defiant, human, and the air ignited. Her breath hitched. Her body erupted. Curves surged, lush, unstoppable. Her tunic tearing as an ancient force roared to life within her. The Primal Bond, a law spark between their kinds, outlawed for centuries. His scent had claimed her, and she couldn't fight it. The arena demanded blood. The Empire demanded order. But she demanded him. They flee. They defy. Together, they burn. What happens when a forbidden bond shatters an alien dynasty? When a warrior and a healer become outlaws of desire? When passion turns into power? Smash that subscribe button and ring the bell. Because the trials of unity are only the start, and what's coming next will leave you speechless. The twin suns of Korrath Prime blazed overhead, their red light casting long shadows across the crimson sands of the arena. Jace Ryder gripped the jagged remnant of his cockpit's control panel, a makeshift blade he'd torn free from the wreckage of his crashed starfighter. His breath came in ragged gasps, his flight suit torn at the shoulders, revealing a broad chest slick with sweat and streaked with blood. Around him, the air thrummed with the roars of 1,000 alien spectators, their voices a chaotic symphony of hunger and excitement. He was the last human standing, the sole survivor of a doomed squadron ambushed by the Vorgoth, a vicious species of insectoid warriors whose spiked exoskeletons gleamed like black steel under the harsh light. Jace's dark hair clung to his forehead, damp with perspiration, and his hazel eyes burned with defiance. 3 days ago, he'd been a pilot in Earth's outer fleet, leading a recon mission near the edge of the Orion Nebula. Then the Vorgoth had struck, silent, swift, and merciless, blasting his crew out of the sky. His ship had spiraled down to this godforsaken planet, and now he was here, thrust into a fight for his life. The crowd called him the Outlander, a rare specimen in this brutal game of survival. He tightened his grip on the jagged metal as the gate across the arena rattled open. A Vorgoth warrior emerged, its 6 legs clicking against the sand, mandibles snapping with a sound like breaking bones. It stood twice his height, its spiked arms glinting as it charged. Jace rolled to the side, sand sprang around him, and slashed upward. The blade caught the creature's underbelly, spilling thick green ichor that hissed as it hit the ground. The crowd erupted, their cheers shaking the stone stands. His muscles screamed with every move, the ache of 3 sleepless days weighing him down. Sweat poured from his brow, stinging his eyes, but he couldn't stop. Another Vorgoth burst from the gate, this one faster, its spiked tail whipping toward him. Jace ducked, feeling the air whistle above his head, and drove his weapon into the beast's leg joint. It screeched a piercing guttural sound and stumbled, giving him just enough time to scramble back. The arena was a furnace, the heat amplifying the stench of blood and alien gore. Jace's shirt hung in tatters, clinging to his torso like a second skin, outlining the hard lines of his chest and the ripple of his abs. He'd always been fit, years of pilot training demanded it, but now every ounce of that strength was being tested. His boots sank into the sand as he circled the wounded Vorgoth, searching for an opening. The creature lunged, and he sidestepped, plunging the blade into its eye. It collapsed with a shudder, and the crowd's roar grew deafening. Jace panted, wiping his face with the back of his hand, smearing blood and sweat across his stubbled jaw. He barely had a moment to catch his breath before the ground trembled again. A third Vorgoth, this one larger than the others, stormed into the arena, its carapace scarred from past battles. The spectators leaned forward, their eyes gleaming with bloodlust. Jace's heart pounded, adrenaline surging through his veins. He couldn't keep this up much longer. The beast charged, its spiked arms slashing in a blur. Jace dove beneath it, rolling across the sand, and sprang up behind it. With a yell, he drove the metal shard into the base of its skull, twisting until he felt the crunch of bone. The Vorgoth thrashed, its tail slamming into his side, sending him sprawling. Pain flared through his ribs, but he gritted his teeth and pushed himself up, delivering a final blow. The creature went still, and silence fell for a heartbeat before the stands exploded in cheers. Jace staggered, his vision swimming. Blood dripped from a gash on his arm, mixing with the sweat that soaked his body. His legs buckled, and he dropped to one knee, the jagged blade slipping from his hand. The crowd chanted Outlander. Outlander, a title he didn't want but couldn't escape. He'd survive, but at what cost? His crew was gone, his ship was scrap, and he was a prisoner on a planet that thrived on death. Heavy footsteps approached, and he looked up through blurred eyes. Two Kalthari guards, tall, blue-skinned figures in black armor, loomed over him. Their violet eyes glinted with cold curiosity, and one muttered something in a clicking language Jace didn't understand. Before he could react, they seized his arms, dragging him across the sand. His head lolled, exhaustion pulling him under, but he caught glimpses of the arena shrinking behind him. The crimson dunes, the jagged cliffs, the twin suns glaring down like merciless gods. They hauled him through a stone archway into the cool darkness beneath the stands. The air shifted, thick with the metallic tang of alien machinery and the faint hum of power cells. Jace's boots scraped against the floor as the guards pulled him down a winding corridor, their grip bruising his already battered arms. He tried to speak, to demand where they were taking him, but his throat was raw, his voice a croak. The fight had taken everything, every ounce of strength, every shred of hope. The corridor opened into a small chamber, its walls lined with glowing panels and shelves of strange tools. A metal table sat in the center, cold and unyielding. The guards dumped him onto it, his body hitting the surface with a dull thud. Pain shot through his side, and he groaned, rolling onto his back. The guards stepped away, their armored boots clanking as they retreated to the door. One lingered, staring at him with an unreadable expression, then turned and left, sealing the entrance with a hiss. Jace lay there, chest heaving, the cold metal leaching the heat from his skin. His shirt was a ruin, plastered to him with sweat, the fabric stretched tight across his shoulders. Blood trickled from the cut on his arm, pooling beneath him, and his ribs throbbed with every breath. He closed his eyes, trying to steady himself, but the room spun, a mix of pain, fatigue, and the lingering rush of survival. A soft sound broke the silence, the click of lighter footsteps approaching. Jace forced his eyes open, squinting against the dim light. A figure emerged from the shadows, and his breath caught. She was unlike anything he'd seen on this hellish planet. Her skin shimmered a deep, iridescent blue, catching the glow of the panels like liquid sapphire. Long violet hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face both sharp and delicate. High cheekbones, full lips, and eyes that burned a vivid gold. She wore a fitted tunic, its fabric hugging her slender frame, and carried a satchel of medical tools slung across her chest. She stopped a few feet away, tilting her head as she studied him. "So, you're the Outlander," she said, her voice low and melodic, tinged with an accent that rolled off her tongue like music. "The human who refuses to die." Jace swallowed, his throat dry. "Didn't have much choice," he rasped, forcing a weak grin. His gaze flicked over her graceful posture, the way her tunic clung to her curves, and he felt a flicker of something beyond the pain, something raw and instinctive. She stepped closer, her golden eyes narrowing as she scanned his injuries. "You're a mess," she muttered, setting her satchel on the table. "But alive." That's more than most can say after facing the Vorgoth. "Who are you?" he managed, his voice rough but steadying. "Veyra," she replied, pulling a slim device from her bag. "I'm the one who decides if you stay that way." She leaned in, her hair brushing the edge of the table, and Jace caught a faint scent, like rain and spice, cool against the heat of his skin. Her presence was a stark contrast to the brutality of the arena, and for a moment he forgot the ache in his bones. But as she reached for his arm, her fingers hovering above his bloodied skin, the air between them shifted. His sweat-soaked body, still radiating the heat of battle, filled the small space with a primal scent, one that had kept him alive in the arena. And as Veyra's hand brushed his wrist, her breath hitched, her eyes widening in a way that told Jace something was about to change, something neither of them could control. The medical bay beneath the arena of Korrath Prime was a sanctuary of cold metal and faint light, a sharp relief from the searing chaos Jace Ryder had just endured. He lay on the table, his body a map of bruises and cuts, each breath a reminder of the Vorgoth claws that had nearly ended him. Sweat soaked through his shredded flight suit, plastering it to his skin, outlining the hard planes of his chest and the taut muscles of his arms. The air was thick with the metallic hum of alien machinery, but it couldn't drown out the pounding of his heart or the exhaustion pulling at his edges. Veyra stood over him, her presence a striking contrast to the grim surroundings. Her iridescent blue skin caught the glow of the wall panels, shimmering like liquid sapphire, and her violet hair flowed down her back, vibrant against the muted tones of her tunic. Her golden eyes studied him with an intensity that made Jace's pulse skip, though he wasn't sure if it was from pain or the way she seemed to see right through him. She moved with a quiet grace, her slender fingers deft as she set a handheld scanner beside him and reached for his arm. "Hold still," she said, her voice smooth and melodic, laced with an accent that danced on the edge of his understanding. Her cool fingertips brushed his wrist, and Jace tensed, a shiver racing up his spine. Her touch was clinical, meant to assess, but it stirred something in him, a flicker of warmth amid the cold ache of his injuries. She tilted his arm, inspecting the jagged gash that ran from his elbow to his shoulder, her brows knitting in concentration. "You're lucky," she murmured, her tone soft but edged with something like wonder. "Most who face the Vorgoth don't get to bleed this long, or breathe." Her fingers lingered, tracing the wound's edge with a feather-light touch, and Jace winced, though he couldn't tell if it was the sting or the sudden heat of her closeness that made him react. She was near now, her tunic brushing the table's side, and a faint scent, like rain mixed with a hint of spice, drifted from her, cutting through the stale air. "Lucky's one way to put it," he rasped, his throat raw from shouting in the arena. He shifted, trying to sit up, but a sharp stab in his ribs stopped him cold. He grunted, collapsing back, and Veyra's hand pressed gently against his chest, pinning him down with surprising strength. "Don't move," she warned, her voice firm yet tinged with concern. "You've got cracked ribs, a torn shoulder, and more cuts than I can count. I need to stabilize you before you tear yourself apart." Her palm rested there, steady and warm through the damp fabric, and Jace felt his heart thud harder, too hard, maybe for just the pain. Her touch lingered a beat longer than necessary, and he wondered if she noticed the way his pulse quickened beneath her fingers. She pulled back, reaching into her satchel for a vial of clear liquid and a cloth. Jace watched her, his haze of fatigue sharpening into something clearer, more focused. Her tunic hugged her frame, accentuating the gentle curve of her hips and the subtle rise of her chest. She moved with precision, every motion deliberate, like she'd patched up countless warriors before him. But there was a tremble in her hands, a quick flick of her golden eyes toward his face that hinted at something beneath her calm exterior, something unsteady, unguarded. "What's a doctor doing in a place like this?" he asked, needing to fill the silence, to tether himself to something beyond the throbbing in his bones. His voice steadied, though it still carried the gravel of exhaustion, and he flashed a crooked grin. "Doesn't seem like the healing type run Korrath Prime." Veyra paused, her lips curving into a small, wry smile that softened her sharp features. "They don't," she said, uncapping the vial with a faint pop. "This planet's a machine, built on blood, fueled by spectacle. I'm here because someone has to stitch up the survivors, or at least what's left of them after the crowd's had its fun." She leaned in, pressing the damp cloth to his arm, and a cool sensation spread, numbing the sting. Jace hissed through his teeth, but the relief was instant, soothing the fire in his skin. "So you're the cleanup crew," he said, his grin widening despite the ache. "Guess that makes me your latest project." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, a spark of amusement dancing in their golden depths. "Something like that," she replied, moving the cloth to a cut on his shoulder where the suit had ripped away. "You're my first human, though. I've heard of your kind, stubborn, reckless, but I've never seen one up close until now." Her fingers brushed his bare skin, and the contact sent a jolt through him, brief but electric. "First human, huh?" he said, leaning into the banter to keep his mind off the pain and the way her touch lingered in his senses. "Guess I'm special then, or just a pain in the ass." "Both, maybe," she shot back, her smile deepening for a moment before she refocused on her work. She shifted closer, reaching across him to dab at a wound on his side. Her hair fell forward, brushing his chest like a whisper of silk, and her face hovered inches from his. Jace's breath caught, the air thickening with the heat pouring off him, the sweat of battle, the raw scent of survival, and it washed over her in a wave. Veyra froze, her hand stilling against his ribs, her cloth poised mid-motion. Her breath hitched, a sharp, unsteady sound, and her eyes widened, pupils dilating in sudden alarm. "What's wrong?" Jace asked, his voice dropping low, concern cutting through the haze of attraction. He propped himself up on one elbow, ignoring the stab in his side, and reached for her wrist. "You okay?" She didn't answer right away. Her chest rose and fell faster, her free hand gripping the table's edge as if to anchor herself. Then, before Jace's eyes, her body began to change. It started with a tremble, a ripple that raced from her shoulders down her spine, like a current under her skin. Her tunic stretched tight across her chest as her breast swelled, the fabric groaning against the sudden fullness, the seams straining to hold her new shape. Her hips flared out, rounding dramatically, and her backside expanded, pressing against her pants until they hugged her curves like a second skin, outlining every contour in a way that made Jace's throat go dry. He stared, his jaw slack, a rush of shock and fascination flooding him. "Holy hell," he muttered, unable to tear his gaze away. Her tunic clung to her now, accentuating the lush swell of her chest, and her pants stretched taut over her thighs and hips, revealing a form that was both alien and undeniably captivating. Sweat beaded on his brow, his body responding with a heat that had nothing to do with his injuries, a primal pull he couldn't shake. Veyra gasped, a sound that was half panic, half something deeper, something raw and untamed. She stumbled back, her hands flying to her chest, then her hips, as if she could force the changes to stop. "No, no, no," she whispered, her voice trembling, breaking on the edges. Her golden eyes darted to Jace, wide with a mix of fear and confusion. "It's you, your scent. My scent." Jace echoed, sitting up fully now, wincing as his ribs screamed in protest. He swung his legs off the table, boots hitting the floor with a heavy thud, and took a step toward her, his breath uneven. "What are you talking about?" He moved closer, drawn by the magnetic shift in her presence, his own pulse hammering in his ears. "Stay back," she snapped, throwing up a hand, though her voice cracked with uncertainty. She pressed herself against the wall, her chest heaving, the tunic stretched so tight it seemed ready to give way. Her pants clung to her newly rounded hips, and a flush spread across her blue skin, deepening it to a rich cobalt. "Your sweat, it's triggering something in me. A reaction my kind hasn't felt in centuries." Jace stopped, hands raised, but his eyes couldn't leave her. She was breathtaking, her shimmering skin glowing faintly, her violet hair wild around her flushed face, her transformed body a vision of beauty reshaped by whatever force he'd unleashed. "What kind of reaction?" he asked, his voice husky, laced with both concern and a curiosity he couldn't suppress. Veyra swallowed hard, her hands still clutching herself as if to hold onto her composure. "The Kalthari, we have legends," she said, her words halting, pieced together through her ragged breathing. "Long ago, our ancestors bonded with a species whose pheromones matched ours, a primal call, a mating signal. It was wild, uncontrollable, so we suppressed it, buried it in our history. But you—" She met his gaze, her eyes darkening with something that wasn't just fear, something that mirrored the heat stirring in him. "You smell like them." Jace blinked, his mind racing to catch up. "You're saying my sweat did this?" He gestured to her, his hand hovering in the air, itching to close the distance but holding back. "Turned you into this?" She nodded, the flush on her cheeks spreading down her neck, tinting her skin a deeper blue. "It's involuntary," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, heavy with a mix of shame and wonder. "Your pheromones. They're waking something in me I can't stop." She shifted, and the movement made her tunic ride up slightly, exposing a sliver of smooth, shimmering skin above her waistband. Jace's mouth went dry, his body tightening in response, though he fought to keep his focus on her words. "Okay," he said, forcing his tone to steady to ground them both. "So what we do? Can you fix it?" He took a cautious step closer, drawn by her vulnerability, wanting to help even as his blood thrummed with something wilder. He could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the way her skin glistened with a faint sheen of sweat. Her own now, not his, and it pulled at him, a thread he couldn't ignore. "I don't know," she admitted, her hands dropping to her sides, trembling as they brushed her newly curved hips. "It's stabilizing, I think, but—" She looked down at herself, then back at him, her golden eyes locking with his hazel ones. "It's not just physical. I feel you, your presence. It's like a thread tying me to you, pulling tighter every second." Jace felt it too, a strange warmth blooming in his chest, spreading through him, centering somewhere deeper. He'd faced death in the arena, but this was different, more dangerous, more alive. He was close enough now to hear the soft catch in her breath, to see the way her lips parted slightly, trembling with the weight of what she'd said. His hand twitched, aching to reach out, to touch her and see if that thread would snap or tighten. But he held back, sensing the fragile line they balanced on. "Veyra," he started, his voice low, rough with the strain of holding himself together. "If this is some kind of bond, what does it mean? For you? For us?" He took another step, closing the gap until he could feel the heat radiating from her, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. Her eyes searched his, a storm of emotions swirling in their golden depths. Fear, confusion, and something hotter, something that matched the fire building in him. "It means trouble," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For both of us. If anyone finds out." A loud clang cut her off, the heavy thud of boots on stone, echoing down the corridor outside. Veyra's head snapped toward the door, her body tensing like a coiled spring. "They're coming," she hissed, her voice sharp with urgency. "The guards, they can't see me like this. Not now." Jace's instincts surged past the haze of attraction, snapping him into action. He grabbed her wrist, his grip firm but careful, his skin rough against her smooth blue flesh. "Then we move," he said, his tone low and resolute, a promise wrapped in the words. "Now." She didn't pull away, her hand warm in his, her pulse racing beneath his fingers. Together, they slipped into the shadows of the bay, her transformed figure brushing against him as they darted toward the darkness. The air crackled with danger ahead and desire behind, a volatile mix that Jace knew would either save them or destroy them both. The shadows of the medical bay swallowed Jace Ryder and Veyra as they slipped away from the table, her wrist still gripped in his calloused hand. The clang of boots grew louder, echoing off the stone walls like a drumbeat of doom, and Jace's heart pounded in his chest. not just from the threat closing in, but from the heat of her skin against his. Veyra's transformed body moved beside him, her newly rounded hips brushing his thigh in the tight space, sending a jolt through him that he shoved down hard. There was no time for distraction, not now. "Over here," she hissed, tugging him toward a narrow alcove at the back of the chamber. Her voice was low, urgent, and Jace followed without question, ducking behind a stack of metal crates just as the door hissed open. The dim light spilled in, casting long shadows as two Kalthari guards stepped through, their black armor glinting like beetle shells. Their violet eyes scanned the room, and one let out a sharp click, a sound that grated against Jace's nerves. "Where's the healer?" the taller guard growled, his voice a deep rumble that vibrated through the floor. "And that human filth she's tending?" Jace pressed himself against the crates, his shoulder brushing Veyra's. She was trembling, her breath shallow, and he could feel the tension radiating from her. Her tunic clung to her curves, stretched tight over her chest, and her pants hug her hips in a way that made it impossible not to notice, even in the dark, even with danger breathing down their necks. He forced his eyes up to her face, catching the flicker of fear in her golden gaze. "They'll kill you if they find us," she whispered, her lips barely moving. "And me, they'll punish me for this." She gestured faintly to her body, her hand hovering over her swollen chest, then dropping as if ashamed. "Then we don't let them find us," Jace replied, his voice a low growl of determination. He squeezed her wrist, a silent promise, and scanned the alcove. A grate sat low on the wall, its edges rusted but loose, big enough to crawl through if they moved fast. "There," he said, nodding toward it. "Can you make it?" Veyra hesitated, glancing down at herself, then nodded sharply. "I'll have to." Her tone was grim, but there was a spark of resolve in it that Jace admired. She pulled her wrist free and dropped to her knees, her movements clumsy with her new proportions. Jace followed, wincing as his cracked ribs protested, and yanked the grate open with a scrape that made them both freeze. The guard's head snapped toward the sound, their boots thudding closer. "Check the back," one barked, and Jace didn't wait. He pushed Veyra forward, her violet hair trailing behind her as she crawled into the tunnel. Her hips caught briefly on the edges, the fabric of her pants stretching taut, and Jace's breath hitched, half from urgency, half from the sight. He shoved the thought aside, sliding in after her and pulling the grate shut just as a guard's shadow loomed over the crates. The tunnel was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of mold and rust. Jace crawled behind Veyra, the space so narrow his shoulders scraped the walls, his boots slipping on the slick stone. Her breathing echoed ahead of him, fast and ragged, and he could hear the faint rustle of her tunic as she moved. The guards' voices faded, replaced by the drip of water and the distant roar of the arena above, but Jace knew they weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. "Keep going," he urged, his voice hushed but firm. "We need distance." His ribs ached with every inch, and sweat stung his eyes, but he pushed through, driven by the need to protect her and himself. Veyra didn't respond, but her pace quickened, her silhouette a faint shimmer in the gloom. The tunnel twisted and dipped, branching into a maze of passages that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath Korrath Prime. Jace's hands pressed into the wet stone, his muscles straining as he kept up. Veyra slowed ahead, her breath hitching, and he caught up to find her leaning against the wall, her chest heaving. The tunnel widened here, a small chamber carved out of the rock, its ceiling dripping with moisture that glistened on her blue skin. The shadows of the medical bay swallowed Jace Ryder and Veyra as they slipped away from the table, her wrist still gripped in his calloused hand. The clang of boots grew louder, echoing off the stone walls like a drumbeat of doom, and Jace's heart pounded in his chest, not just from the threat closing in, but from the heat of her skin against his. Veyra's transformed body moved beside him, her newly rounded hips brushing his thigh in the tight space, sending a jolt through him that he shoved down hard. There was no time for distraction, not now. "Over here," she hissed, tugging him toward a narrow alcove at the back of the chamber. Her voice was low, urgent, and Jace followed without question, ducking behind a stack of metal crates just as the door hissed open. The dim light spilled in, casting long shadows as two Kalthari guards stepped through, their black armor glinting like beetle shells. Their violet eyes scanned the room, and one let out a sharp click, a sound that grated against Jace's nerves. "Where's the healer?" the taller guard growled, his voice a deep rumble that vibrated through the floor. "And that human filth she's tending?" Jace pressed himself against the crates, his shoulder brushing Veyra's. She was trembling, her breath shallow, and he could feel the tension radiating from her. Her tunic clung to her curves, stretched tight over her chest, and her pants hugged her hips in a way that made it impossible not to notice, even in the dark, even with danger breathing down their necks. He forced his eyes up to her face, catching the flicker of fear in her golden gaze. "They'll kill you if they find us," she whispered, her lips barely moving. "And me, they'll punish me for this." She gestured faintly to her body, her hand hovering over her swollen chest, then dropping as if ashamed. "Then we don't let them find us," Jace replied, his voice a low growl of determination. He squeezed her wrist, a silent promise, and scanned the alcove. A grate sat low on the wall, its edges rusted but loose, big enough to crawl through if they moved fast. "There," he said, nodding toward it. "Can you make it?" Veyra hesitated, glancing down at herself, then nodded sharply. "I'll have to." Her tone was grim, but there was a spark of resolve in it that Jace admired. She pulled her wrist free and dropped to her knees, her movements clumsy with her new proportions. Jace followed, wincing as his cracked ribs protested, and yanked the grate open with a scrape that made them both freeze. The guards' heads snapped toward the sound, their boots thudding closer. "Check the back," one barked, and Jace didn't wait. He pushed Veyra forward, her violet hair trailing behind her as she crawled into the tunnel. Her hips caught briefly on the edges, the fabric of her pants stretching taut, and Jace's breath hitched, half from urgency, half from the sight. He shoved the thought aside, sliding in after her and pulling the grate shut just as a guard's shadow loomed over the crates. The tunnel was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of mold and rust. Jace crawled behind Veyra, the space so narrow his shoulders scraped the walls, his boots slipping on the slick stone. Her breathing echoed ahead of him, fast and ragged, and he could hear the faint rustle of her tunic as she moved. The guards' voices faded, replaced by the drip of water and the distant roar of the arena above, but Jace knew they weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. "Keep going," he urged, his voice hushed but firm. "We need distance." His ribs ached with every inch, and sweat stung his eyes, but he pushed through, driven by the need to protect her and himself. Veyra didn't respond, but her pace quickened, her silhouette a faint shimmer in the gloom. The tunnel twisted and dipped, branching into a maze of passages that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath Korrath Prime. Jace's hands pressed into the wet stone, his muscles straining as he kept up. Veyra slowed ahead, her breath hitching, and he caught up to find her leaning against the wall, her chest heaving. The tunnel widened here, a small chamber carved out of the rock, its ceiling dripping with moisture that glistened on her blue skin. Her hands paused, trembling slightly, and she looked up at him, her face inches from his. "It's worse when you're this close," she murmured, her voice shaky. "The bond, it's louder, stronger." "Yeah," Jace said, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. He didn't move, didn't dare break the moment, but his eyes locked with hers, searching. "What does it feel like?" "Like fire," she breathed, her golden eyes darkening. "Like I can't breathe without feeling you." Her hand rested on his arm, her fingers curling slightly, and Jace felt the heat of her touch sear through him. His own hand lifted, hovering near her cheek, drawn by the shimmer of her skin, the vulnerability in her gaze. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just them, the damp tunnel, the danger, the arena, all fading into the background. His fingers brushed her jaw, rough against her smoothness, and she leaned into it, her lips parting with a soft gasp. The air crackled, thick with tension, with the promise of something neither could name. Jace's pulse roared in his ears, his body aching to close the gap, to taste that rain-in spice scent on her lips. But then a distant shout shattered the silence. "Search the tunnels," a guard's voice echoed, sharp and commanding, followed by the clank of armor. Veyra jerked back, her hand flying to her chest, her eyes wide with panic. "They're coming," she said, scrambling to her feet. Her transformed figure swayed slightly, unsteady, and Jace stood too, his ribs protesting, but his focus razor-sharp. "Which way?" he asked, grabbing her hand again, his grip firm and steadying. Her fingers tightened around his, a lifeline in the dark. "There," she said, pointing to a branching passage on the left. "It leads deeper, away from the arena." She took a step, then hesitated, looking back at him. "Jace, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said, flashing a grim smile. "We're not out of this." He pulled her forward, their hands locked together, and they plunged into the tunnel, the sound of pursuit growing louder behind them. The thread between them pulsed, stronger with every step, binding them in a way neither could escape, and neither wanted to, not anymore. The tunnel stretched on, a twisting labyrinth of damp stone and flickering shadows, but Jace Ryder could feel the walls closing in, not just from the tight passage, but from the relentless thud of boots echoing behind them. He gripped Veyra's hand tighter, his rough fingers laced with her smooth ones, pulling her along as they stumbled through the dark. Her breath came in quick, sharp gasps, her transformed body struggling to keep pace, and every so often her hip brushed aside, sending a jolt through him that he couldn't afford to dwell on. Sweat stung his eyes, his cracked ribs screamed with every step, but he pushed forward, driven by the need to keep her safe. "Faster," he urged, his voice a low growl, barely audible over the drip of water and the distant shouts of the Kalthari guards. Veyra nodded, her violet hair whipping behind her, and picked up her speed, though her new curves made her movements awkward, her tunic and pants straining against her skin. The air was thick with tension, fear, desperation, and that unspoken thread between them, tugging harder with every heartbeat. The tunnel veered sharply left, and Jace yanked her around the corner, pressing them both against the wall. His chest heaved, his damp shirt clinging to him, outlining the hard lines of his muscles as he strained to listen. The shouts grew closer, the clank of armor sharper now, and he cursed under his breath. "They're gaining," he muttered, glancing at Veyra. Her golden eyes met his, wide with panic but steady with resolve, and for a moment he saw something fierce in her, a strength that matched his own. "There's a junction ahead," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "It splits 3 ways. We can lose them if we pick the right one." She pointed down the passage, her hand brushing his arm, and the contact sent a shiver through him, brief but electric. He nodded, shoving down the heat that flared in his chest, and pulled her forward again. They reached the junction, a cavernous split in the rock, 3 dark mouths yawning before them. Jace hesitated, his hazel eyes scanning each path, but before he could choose, a guttural shout rang out behind them. "There!" A guard rounded the corner, his black armor gleaming, a spear leveled at their backs. Jace spun, shoving Veyra behind him, his body a shield between her and the threat. "Run!" he barked, but it was too late. More guards poured in, 5 of them now, their violet eyes glinting with cold intent. Jace's fists clenched, his makeshift weapon long gone, but he squared his shoulders, ready to fight with whatever he had left. Veyra grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his skin, her breath hot against his neck as she pressed close. "Don't," she hissed, her voice urgent. "You're hurt. They'll kill you." Her words were a plea, but her grip was fierce, and Jace felt that threat again, binding them, urging him to listen. He gritted his teeth, his body tense, but he didn't move. Not yet. The lead guard stepped forward, his spear tip inches from Jace's chest. "The Outlander and the Healer," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Lord Druun will want to see this." His eyes flicked to Veyra, narrowing as they took in her transformed figure. The swollen chest, the flared hips, and a cruel smirk twisted his lips. "Especially you, traitor." Jace's blood boiled, his hands itching to wipe that smirk off the guard's face, but Veyra's grip tightened, holding him back. "Don't give them a reason," she murmured, her voice low, meant only for him. The guards closed in, their spears hurting them like cattle, and Jace had no choice but to let them lead. He kept Veyra close, his arm brushing hers, a silent vow to protect her no matter what came next. The journey back through the tunnels was a blur of cold stone and sharp prods from spear tips. Jace's ribs ached, his legs burned, but he kept his head high, his gaze locked on Veyra's back as she walked ahead of him. Her posture was stiff, her hands clenched at her sides, but there was a defiance in the way she moved, a refusal to bow, even now. The guards marched them up a winding ramp, the air growing warmer, heavier, until they emerged into a vast chamber overlooking the arena. The room was a stark contrast to the tunnels, grand and imposing, its walls carved with jagged runes that glowed faintly red under the light of the twin suns, streaming through a massive skylight. The arena sprawled below, its crimson sands stained with fresh blood, the crowd's distant roars filtering up like a restless beast. At the chamber's center stood a towering figure clad in ornate black armor, his blue skin a deeper shade than Veyra's, his violet hair pulled back in a severe braid. Lord Kael Druun turned as they entered, his golden eyes, eerily like Veyra's, fixing on them with a cold, unreadable stare. The guard shoved Jace and Veyra forward, forcing them to their knees. Jace grunted as his ribs jolted, pain flaring white-hot, but he kept his gaze on Kael, refusing to look away. Veyra knelt beside him, her shoulder brushing his, and he could feel her trembling, though her face was a mask of defiance. "So," Kael's voice boomed, deep and resonant, cutting through the chamber like a blade. "The outlander who defies death, and my own sister who defies our laws." His eyes raked over Veyra, lingering on her transformed body, and a flicker of disgust crossed his sharp features. "What have you done, Veyra? What is this abomination?" Veyra lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "It's not my choice, Kael," she said, her tone sharp. His pheromones triggered it, a primal bond like the legends. "You can't blame me for biology." Kael's lip curled, his armored hand clenching into a fist. "Biology?" he spat. "You disgrace our bloodline with this filth." He stepped closer, towering over them, and Jace tensed, ready to lunge if he had to. "And you," Kael said, turning to Jace, his gaze piercing. "A human, a weak, insignificant species, dares to tame my sister? To awaken something we buried for centuries?" Jace met his stare, his jaw tight. "Didn't exactly plan it," he said, his voice rough but steady. "But I'm not sorry for keeping her alive. You know something about that, running this death trap." Kael's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint in them. But before he could respond, Veyra cut in. "He's not the enemy, Kael," she said, rising to her feet despite the guard's spears. Her tunic stretched tight across her chest, her hips swaying slightly as she stepped forward, and Jace couldn't help but admire her courage. "This bond, it's real. I feel it. Punish me if you want, but don't pretend it's his fault." The chamber fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Kael's gaze flicked between them, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to the guards. "Chain them," he ordered, his voice cold. "They'll face the trials of unity. If this bond is real, let it prove itself, or let them die trying." Jace's stomach dropped, but he didn't flinch as the guards yanked him to his feet, their rough hands clamping metal cuffs around his wrists. Veyra was shackled beside him, her golden eyes meeting his, a storm of fear and determination swirling in them. "Trials of unity," he muttered, leaning closer as the guards pulled them toward side door. "What's that?" "Old rites," she whispered, her voice trembling but fierce. "Strength, sync, spirit, test to prove a bond's worth. If we fail, we're dead." If we pass, she trailed off, her gaze dropping, but Jace caught the flicker of hope in her eyes. Guess we're passing then, he said, flashing a grim smile despite the pain shooting through his ribs. Not dying today. The guard shoved them through the door, down a narrow stairwell that spiraled deeper into the rock. The air grew hot and thick, the distant roar of the arena growing louder, and Jace felt the weight of what was coming settle on his shoulders. The trials, whatever they were, would test more than his body, more than his will. They'd test this bond, this thread pulling him to Veyra, and he wasn't sure what scared him more, failing or what it meant if they succeeded. The stairwell opened into a holding cell, its walls slick with moisture, its floor littered with straw. The guards unchained their wrists but locked the door behind them, leaving them alone in the dim light of a single glowing crystal embedded in the ceiling. Jace slumped against the wall, his breath ragged, and Veyra sank down beside him, her shoulder brushing his again. "We're in it now," he said, his voice low, a mix of exhaustion and resolve. "Your brother's a real piece of work." Veyra huffed a bitter laugh, brushing her violet hair from her face. "He's always been like this, ruthless, obsessed with control. He thinks the Primal Bond is a weakness, a stain on our legacy." She glanced at him, her eyes softening. "But it doesn't feel weak to me." Jace turned to her, his hazel eyes searching hers. "What does it feel like?" he asked, echoing their moment in the tunnel, his voice rough with curiosity and something deeper. She hesitated, then shifted closer, her knee pressing against his. "Like you're part of me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like I'd fight for you, die for you, even if I don't understand why." Her hand rested on the floor between them, inches from his, and Jace felt that thread tighten, pulling him toward her like a magnet. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers, rough against her smoothness. "I feel it too," he admitted, his voice husky. "Not sure what it means, but I'm not letting it. Where you go." Her breath hitched, her golden eyes darkening, and for a moment, they leaned closer, the air between them crackling with heat and unspoken need. But then a horn blared from above, sharp and commanding, and Veyra pulled back, her face hardening. "The trials," she said, standing and offering him her hand. "They're starting." Jace took it, letting her pull him up, his body protesting, but his resolve firm. Her touch lingered, her fingers warm in his, and he squeezed them once before letting go. "Let's show them what this bond can do," he said, his grin fierce despite the odds. Together, they faced the door, the roar of the arena vibrating through the stone, a promise of blood and fire waiting beyond. The trials loomed, and with them, a chance, not just to survive, but to prove something neither of them could yet name. The roar of the arena slammed into Jace Ryder and Veyra like a physical force as the cell door creaked open, revealing the sprawling expanse of crimson sand beyond. The twin suns of Korrath Prime hung high, their red light bathing the jagged cliffs in a fiery glow, casting long shadows across the battleground. The air pulsed with the crowd's hunger, thousands of alien voices rising in a chaotic chant. "Outlander! Outlander!" that rattled the stone beneath their feet. Jay stepped out first, his boots crunching into the sand, each movement sending a sharp stab through his cracked ribs. Sweat already glistened on his brow, his tattered flight suit clinging to his broad chest, the damp fabric outlining the hard lines of his muscles. His hazel eyes burned with a mix of exhaustion and defiance, refusing to bow to this brutal world. Veyra followed close behind, her iridescent blue skin catching the sunlight in a shimmer that made her stand out against the dull red dunes. Her violet hair whipped in the hot wind, framing her sharp features, and her transformed body, chest swollen, hips flared, drew gasps and murmurs from the stands. Her tunic stretched tight across her curves, her pants hugging her thighs and backside in a way that seemed to defy the fabric's limits. She held her head high, her golden eyes flickering with a storm of emotions, fear, resolve, and something fiercer. But Jace could see the slight tremble in her hands, the way her breath caught as she took in the scene. He shifted closer, his shoulder brushing hers, a quiet reassurance in the chaos. Above them, Lord Kael Druun loomed on a raised platform, his black armor gleaming like a dark mirror, his stern face carved from cold authority. A dozen Kalthari elites flanked him, their violet eyes glinting with a mix of curiosity and disdain, their ornate robes rustling in the breeze. Kael raised a hand, and the crowd fell silent instantly, the weight of his presence suffocating. His voice boomed across the arena, deep and commanding. "The Outlander and the traitor claim a primal bond," he declared, his tone laced with contempt. "Let the trials of unity prove their worth or their doom. Begin." A horn blared, its sharp note slicing through the tension, and the ground trembled as a massive gate on the far side of the arena rattled open. Jace tensed, his fists clenching at his sides, his body coiled like a spring despite the pain radiating from his ribs. Veyra's hand brushed his arm, her touch fleeting but grounding, and she leaned in, her voice a whisper over the growing roar. "Strength first," she said, her breath warm against his ear. "Survive this, and we're halfway there." He nodded, his jaw tight, but before he could reply, a colossal Vorgoth erupted from the gate, its spiked exoskeleton glinting like polished obsidian under the suns. It towered over them, twice Jace's height, its 6 legs pounding the sand with thunderous force, its mandibles snapping with a sound like breaking steel. The crowd exploded, their cheers a deafening wall of sound, and Jace's pulse surged, adrenaline flooding his veins, drowning out the ache in his bones. "Stay back," he told Veyra, stepping forward, his instincts kicking in. He scanned the sand for anything he could use, a rock, a shard of metal, ready to face the beast alone. But Veyra grabbed his wrist, her grip fierce, her nails digging into his skin. "No," she said, her voice low and urgent, cutting through the noise. "This is our trial, together." Her golden eyes locked with his, a fire burning in them that matched the defiance in his own, and Jace felt a surge of something, pride, trust, connection, that steadied him. He gave a sharp nod, his lips twitching into a grim smile. "Together, then," he said, and they turned as one to face the Vorgoth. The beast charged, its spiked arms slashing in a deadly arc. Jace dove left, rolling across the sand, the impact jarring his ribs and drawing a grunt from his throat. Veyra darted right, her movements swift and graceful despite her transformed figure, her hair a violet blur in the wind. Jace scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting to a fallen spear half buried near the arena wall, a jagged, rusted thing, but better than nothing. He lunged for it, pain flaring white-hot through his side, and yanked it free just as the Vorgoth wheeled toward him. Its tail whipped out, fast and lethal, and Jace ducked, the air hissing above his head. Sand sprayed around him, stinging his face, but he held his ground, gripping the spear tight. Veyra shouted something in her clicking Kalthari tongue, her voice sharp and commanding, and the beast's head snapped toward her. She darted close, then away, her tunic fluttering as she baited it, giving Jace an opening. He seized it, sprinting forward and driving the spear into the Vorgoth's leg joint with all his strength. Green ichor sprayed, hissing as it hit the sand, and the creature screeched, a piercing, guttural sound that vibrated through Jace's skull. He yanked the spear free, but the Vorgoth swung its arm, catching him across the chest with a force that sent him sprawling. Pain exploded through his ribs, stealing his breath, and he hit the ground hard, the spear skittering out of reach. The crowd roared, their bloodlust a wave that threatened to drown him, and he clawed at the sand, struggling to rise as the beast loomed closer. "Jace!" Veyra's voice cut through the haze, sharp with desperation. He looked up to see her leap onto the Vorgoth's back, fearless and reckless, her arms wrapping around its thick neck. Her legs straddled its spiked carapace, her tunic tearing at the shoulder as she clung on, her transformed body pressed tight against the beast. "Now!" she yelled, her voice raw. and the Vorgoth thrashed, trying to shake her off. Jace staggered to his feet, his vision swimming, every breath a knife in his chest. He grabbed the spear, sand clinging to his sweat-soaked hands, and charged with a roar of his own. He plunged the weapon into the creature's underbelly, twisting it deep until he felt bone crack and muscle give. The Vorgoth shrieked, its legs buckling, and Veyra jumped clear, rolling across the sand as it collapsed in a heap, green blood pooling around it. Jace stumbled back, panting hard, his chest heaving as he fought to stay upright. Veyra was at his side in an instant, her hand on his arm, steadying him. Her skin glistened with sweat and ichor, her tunic torn and clinging to her curves, and her golden eyes met his, wide with relief and something fiercer, something that made his heart thud harder. "You okay?" she asked, her voice breathless, her fingers tightening on his arm. "Yeah," he rasped, managing a crooked grin despite the pain. "You?" She nodded, her chest rising and falling fast. And for a heartbeat, they stood there, victorious, the arena fading around them. Their bond pulsed, raw, alive, undeniable, but the moment shattered as the horn blared again, sharp and commanding. Kael's voice rang out, cold and unyielding. "Strength is proven. Now sing." The crowd's chants shifted, a new energy rippling through the stands, and a circle of torches flared to life in the arena's center, their flames casting flickering shadows across the sand. Jace wiped his brow, his shirt a wreck, soaked with sweat and streaked with green blood. He glanced at Veyra, his ribs throbbing, but his resolve unshaken. "Sink," he asked, his voice rough from exertion. "A dance," she said, catching her breath as she brushed her violet hair from her face. "A Kalthari rite, moving as one. It tests the bond's harmony." She hesitated, her golden eyes searching his, then added, "Stay close. Follow my lead. Feel me." Jace nodded, trusting her completely now, and they stepped into the circle together. The air grew hotter, the torches crackling with an intensity that mirrored the fire in his chest, and a low, rhythmic drumbeat pulsed from hidden speakers, vibrating through the sand into his bones. Veyra moved first, her hips swaying to the beat, her arms rising in a fluid arc that seemed to pull the light toward her. Jace watched, mesmerized by the grace in her transformed body, the way her curves flowed with every step, then joined her, mirroring her as best he could. Their movements were awkward at first, his steps heavy and uneven, hers lighter but still adjusting to her new form. He stumbled once, his boots sinking into the sand, and Veyra's hand shot out, catching his wrist to steady him. "Focus," she murmured, her voice soft but firm, and he did, locking his eyes on hers. Then something clicked, a shift, a rhythm, and he felt it, that thread she described, guiding him, syncing his heartbeat to hers. His hands found her waist, his rough palms settling against her warm skin where her tunic had ridden up, and she pressed closer, her chest brushing his. The drumbeat quickened, driving them faster, and they spun together, her hair whipping around them like a violet storm. Jace's grip tightened, his fingers splaying across her hips, and Veyra's hands slid up his arms, resting on his shoulders, her touch light but electric. Sweat slicked their skin, mingling where they pressed together, and Jace felt a strange energy flare between them, hot, vibrant, like a current running from her core to his. The crowd faded, the torches blurred into streaks of fire, and it was just them, bodies in perfect rhythm, breaths in sync, hearts pounding as one. Veyra's golden eyes locked with his, darkening with an intensity that stole his breath, and her fingers curled into his shoulders, pulling him closer. The beat peaked, a crescendo that shook the sand, and they froze, chest to chest, her forehead nearly touching his, her lips parted with a soft, shuddering gasp. Jace's hands lingered on her hips, her curves soft yet firm under his touch, and he felt that energy pulse stronger, a tangible bond that made his skin hum and his blood roar. He could feel her heartbeat through her tunic, fast and wild, matching his own, And for a moment, he wanted nothing more than to close that last inch, to taste the sweat and spice on her lips, but the horns sounded, sharp and jarring, pulling them back to reality. Kael's voice cut through the haze, icy and unyielding. Sync is proven. Now, spirit. The torches dimmed, their flames sinking low, and two crystalline pedestals rose from the sand, glowing with an inner light that cast eerie, shifting patterns across the arena. Jace released Veyra, his hands reluctant to leave her warmth, and they stepped apart, both breathing hard from the dance. Sand clung to his boots, sweat dripped from his brow, and he shook his head to clear it, focusing on her. "Spirit," he asked, his voice low and rough, still thick with the heat of their closeness. "Truth," she said, her tone steady but soft, her chest still rising and falling fast. "We speak our hearts to the crystals. If they glow, the bond is true. If they don't," she trailed off, her golden eyes flickering with vulnerability, and Jace understood the stakes. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about them. Veyra went first, stepping to the left pedestal with a grace that belied her exhaustion. She placed her hands on its smooth surface, the crystal pulsing faintly under her touch, and took a deep breath, her voice ringing out clear and strong despite the tremor in it. "I am Veyra of the Kalthari," she began, her words echoing across the sands, cutting through the crowd's restless hum. "I seek freedom, freedom to heal, to live, to choose my path. I've spent my life stitching up the broken, serving others, but I've never fought for myself, never dared to want more." She paused, her gaze shifting to Jace, and her voice softened, raw with emotion. "Until now, this bond, it's not just biology, not just some accident. It's a fire I can't deny, a strength I didn't know I had. I choose it. I choose him, not because I have to, but because I want to." The crystal flared, a brilliant blue light spilling from its core, bathing her in a radiant glow that silenced the crowd for a heartbeat before they erupted in murmurs of awe. Veyra stepped back, her shoulders relaxing slightly, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she looked at Jace, her eyes bright with hope and something deeper, something that made his chest ache in a way he hadn't felt before. He moved to the right pedestal, his boots sinking into the sand, his body protesting every step. He placed his hands on the crystal, its warmth vibrating against his palms, and took a steadying breath, his voice rough but unwavering as it carried over the arena. "I'm Jace Ryder, human, pilot, survivor," he said, his words raw with the weight of everything he'd endured. "I seek a fight worth winning, not just scraping by, not just surviving, but something real, something that matters. I've been alone, drifting through stars and wars, never staying long enough to care. Until this place, until her." He glanced at Veyra, his hazel eyes locking with hers, and his voice dropped, thick with truth. "She's my reason now. This bond, it's not some fluke. It's alive, and I feel it in my bones. I'll stand by it, by her, no matter what." The crystal blazed, a golden light bursting forth, merging with Veyra's blue in a dazzling arc that lit the arena like a supernova. The crowd roared, their cheers shaking the stands, a wave of sound that crashed over them. And Jace stepped back, his heart pounding, not from fear or pain, but from a truth he'd just laid bare, a truth he hadn't fully grasped until he'd said aloud. Kael rose from his platform, his face a storm of fury and reluctant acceptance, his armored hands clenched at his sides. "The trials are complete," he declared, his voice tight, each word forced through gritted teeth. "The bond is proven by strength, sync, and spirit." He paused, his golden eyes boring into them with a cold intensity that promised retribution, then added, "But it changes nothing. You're still mine to judge." Jace's fists clenched, his body tensing as anger flared hot in his chest. But Veyra stepped forward, her voice ringing out like a blade cutting through the tension. "No, Kael," she said, her tone fierce and unyielding. "The trials are sacred. You invoke them yourself. You can't deny their verdict without defying our own laws, our history." She moved to Jace's side, her hand finding his, her fingers intertwining with his in a bold, defiant grip that sent a surge of warmth through him. The crowd's chants shifted. Bonded, bonded, a rising tide of voices that challenged Kael's authority, their fervor fueled by the spectacle they'd witnessed. Kael's jaw tightened, his golden eyes narrowing as he glared at them, his armored hand twitching as if itching to strike. He turned to the elites beside him, his voice low but sharp. "Take them to the holding chamber," he ordered, his tone icy with barely contained rage. "I'll decide their fate at dawn." Guards swarmed the arena, their spears lowered, their black armor glinting as they closed in. Jace pulled Veyra close, his arms sliding around her waist, her body pressing against his, warm, steady, alive. Her skin shimmered with sweat, her torn tunic clinging to her curves, and he felt that bond pulse between them, stronger now, forged in fire and sand, unbreakable even under Kael's shadow. The guards seized their arms, dragging them off the sands, but Jace kept his grip on her hand as long as he could, his thumb brushing her knuckles in silent promise. They were marched back through the tunnels, the roar of the arena fading into a dull hum, and shoved into a holding chamber, a cramped, damp cell with slick walls and a single glowing crystal embedded in the ceiling. The door slammed shut, the lock clanking into place, and the guards' footsteps retreated, leaving them alone in the dim light. Jace slumped against the wall, his breath ragged, every muscle screaming from the trials. Veyra sank down beside him, her shoulder brushing his, her violet hair falling over her face like a curtain. "We did it," he said, his voice rough with triumph, a fierce grin breaking through the exhaustion etched into his features. 3 trials, and we're still standing. Veyra turned to him, her golden eyes catching the crystal's light, and smiled. A rare, radiant thing that softened her sharp edges and lit up the gloom. "We are," she said, her voice soft but sure, heavy with relief. She reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his, and squeezed gently. "Together, together," he echoed, his grin widening as he squeezed back. His other hand lifted, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his rough fingers grazing her cheek. Her skin was warm, shimmering faintly, and she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment. The air between them thickened, that bond humming with a quiet intensity, and Jace felt his chest tighten, not from pain, but from her, from what they'd become. "Dawn's coming," she murmured, her voice low, her eyes opening to meet his. "Kael won't let this go easily." "Let him try," Jace said, his tone fierce, protective. "We've got something he can't break." He held her gaze, his hand still resting against her cheek, and for a moment, the cell, the trials, the threat of Kael, all of it faded. It was just them, bound by more than words, more than crystals, and Jace knew they'd face whatever came next the same way they'd face the arena, together. The holding chamber was a dim cocoon of stone and shadow, the single glowing crystal in the ceiling casting a soft, bluish light over Jace Ryder and Veyra. The air was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the furnace of the arena they'd just survived, and the silence pressed in around them, broken only by the faint drip of water somewhere deep in the walls. Jace leaned against the slick stone, his body a map of aches, his cracked ribs throbbing, his arms heavy from the trials, but a quiet triumph burned in his chest. They'd faced the trials of unity and won, their bond forged in blood, rhythm, and truth, stronger than anything Korrath Prime could throw at them. Veyra sat beside him, her shoulder pressed against his, her iridescent blue skin shimmering faintly in the crystal's glow. Her violet hair spilled over her face, tangled and wild from the chaos of the arena, and her transformed figure, chest full, hips rounded, still stretched her torn tunic and pants to their limits. She was beautiful, fierce, and alive, and Jace couldn't take his eyes off her. Her hand rested in his, their fingers intertwined, and the warmth of her touch anchored him, a lifeline in the uncertainty of what dawn would bring. "We made it," he said, his voice rough but warm, a faint grin tugging at his lips. He tilted his head to look at her, his hazel eyes catching the light. 3 trials, and we're still here. Veyra turned to him, her golden eyes softening, a smile breaking through the exhaustion etched into her features. "We are," she said, her voice low and steady, carrying a quiet wonder. She squeezed his hand, her fingers tightening around his, and the bond between them pulsed, subtle now, but undeniable, a thread that had grown into a lifeline. "I didn't think we'd get this far. Not against Kael, not against everything." Jace chuckled, the sound rough but genuine, and shifted closer, his knee brushing hers. "Guess we're tougher than we look," he said, his grin widening. "Or we're just too stubborn to die." His free hand lifted, brushing a strand of violet hair from her face, his rough fingers grazing her cheek. Her skin was warm, smooth under his touch, and she leaned into it slightly, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment, a soft sigh escaping her lips. The air between them thickened, that bond humming with a gentle intensity, and Jace felt his chest tighten. Not from pain this time, but from the way she fit against him like she'd always belonged there. "You were incredible out there," he murmured, his voice dropping, rough with emotion. "Jumping on that Vorgoth, dancing like that, you didn't hesitate." Her eyes opened, meeting his, and a flush spread across her blue cheeks, deepening them to a rich cobalt. "I had to," she said, her tone soft but firm. "It wasn't just about surviving. It was about us." Her hand shifted in his, her thumb brushing his knuckles, and the simple gesture sent a shiver through him, warm and electric. "Us," he echoed, his grin fading into something softer, more serious. He leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers, and the scent of her, rain and spice, mingled with the sweat of their fight, filled his senses. "That bond you keep talking about, it's real, isn't it? I feel it too, Veyra. Every time you're near, it's like I'm more than I was." Her breath hitched, her golden eyes darkening with a mix of wonder and longing. "It is real," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "It's why I couldn't let you fight alone, why I can't let you go now." She shifted, closing the small gap between them, and her free hand rested on his chest, her fingers splaying over his heart through the damp fabric of his shirt. His pulse jumped under her touch, and he covered her hand with his, holding it there. For a moment, they stayed like that, the world shrinking to just them, the cool stone, the faint light, the steady rhythm of their breathing. Jace's thumb traced circles on her hand, his rough skin contrasting with her smoothness, and he felt that bond flare brighter, a warmth that spread from his chest to every corner of him. He wanted to say more, to tell her how she'd changed him, how she'd given him something worth fighting for. But then the door rattled, a sharp clang that shattered the quiet. They pulled apart, tense and alert, as the lock clicked and the door swung open. 2 Kalthari guards stepped in, their black armor glinting, but their spears hung at their sides, not raised. Behind them stood Lord Kael Druun, his stern face unreadable, his golden eyes fixed on them with a cold intensity. Jace stood, pulling Veyra up with him, his arms sliding around her waist protectively, his body tensing for a fight despite his exhaustion. Kael stepped forward, his boots echoing on the stone, and stopped a few feet away. "The trials have spoken," he said, his voice low and clipped, each word forced through gritted teeth. "Your bond is proven, sacred under Kalthari law." He paused, his gaze flicking to Veyra, a flicker of something, anger, regret, crossing his sharp features. "But the crowd demands more than tradition. They demand freedom for the Outlander and his mate." Jace's brows shot up, his grip on Veyra tightening. "Freedom?" he asked, his voice rough with disbelief. "You're letting us go?" Kael's jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. "Not by choice," he said, his tone icy. "The elites see value in you, your pheromones, your bond. They believe it could heal our kind, restore what we've lost. They've overruled me." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But know this, you'll never be welcome here. Leave Korrath Prime at dawn, and take her with you." Veyra stiffened beside Jace, her hand gripping his, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "And if we refuse?" she asked, her chin lifting in defiance. Kael's eyes narrowed. "You won't," he said, his tone final. "You've won your freedom. Don't test it." He turned, his armor clanking as he strode out, the guards following, and the door slammed shut behind them, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Jace let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Well, damn," he said, turning to Veyra with a crooked grin. "Guess we're out of here." She laughed, a soft, melodic sound that warmed the cold cell, and stepped closer, her hands resting on his chest. "We are," she said, her golden eyes bright with relief and something softer. "But it's more than that. They think you can save us, our people. That's why they're letting us go." Jace raised a brow, his hands settling on her hips, pulling her gently against him. "Save them? I just wanted to save you," he said, his voice low, teasing but honest. Her flush deepened, and she leaned in, her forehead resting against his, her breath mingling with his. "You did," she whispered, her lips brushing his cheek, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down his spine. "And now we've got a chance, a new start." The guards returned at dawn, as promised, leading them through the tunnels to a small, battered ship docked at the edge of Korrath Prime's jagged cliffs. The twin suns were just rising, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold, and Jace helped Veyra aboard, his hand steady on hers. The ship's interior was cramped, its controls worn but functional, and as the engines hummed to life, he turned to her, his grin fierce and free. "Where to?" he asked, settling into the pilot's seat, his hazel eyes locked on hers. She slid into the co-pilot's chair, her transformed figure radiant in the dawn light streaming through the viewport. "Anywhere," she said, her voice soft but sure. "As long as it's with you." Jace reached for her hand, pulling it to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles, his touch lingering. "Good answer," he said, his voice husky, and leaned over, his lips brushing hers in a soft, lingering kiss. Warm, gentle, a promise of more to come. She kissed him back, her hands sliding to his neck, her fingers curling into his hair, and for a moment, the ship, the planet, the past, all of it faded. The engines roared, and the ship lifted off, soaring into the endless stretch of stars. Jace pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the quiet hum of the cockpit. "New dawn, new fight," he murmured, his grin returning. "Ready." "Ready," Veyra echoed, her golden eyes sparkling with hope and love, and together, they turned to face the future, a bond unbroken, a journey just beginning.